Chris here with a bit of a demonstration for everybody on wet palettes. Now I know I've talked about wet palettes before. I have a video. Just click over here. We'll say over here. Let's click here. I have for making a wet palette for less than $4 Canadian, which in US is like $4. But in British pounds or euros, it's like less than that. It's really inexpensive to make a wet palette. There are commercial wet palettes available from, you know, like companies like Privateer Press. They make a really great product there. But for those on the tighter budgets, you know, and you don't have the extra money to spend, a wet palette, and for $4, you can't go wrong with a wet palette. And I know I've talked about this before, and anybody who's been following me for some time knows I go on about wet palettes, and you never really see me use a wet palette in videos because, well, most of the time painting for the camera, using just a regular dry palette to paint. And anybody who's ever used a palette, and everybody should be using a palette to paint, and if you're not, then I'm coming for you. So wet palettes will save you money in the long run. Not just like as soon as you make it, it's gonna save you money. I mean, like over the long run of using a wet palette, it's a very efficient use of your paints, and your paints go a lot further. And so today I'm gonna do a quick little demo using my wet palette, just to show you at how efficient really it uses paint, because essentially it keeps the paint wet longer on your palette, and it pretty much allows you to use like almost all of the paint that you'll put down onto the palette. Now, there have been many videos on making wet palettes, and a lot of them are really, really good. A lot of them will call for, say, for example, household sponges, or even the sponges that you get from the miniature packs. Anybody who's selling like pewter miniatures and a lot of resin miniatures, they'll give you these little foamy inserts, and just to keep, you know, the model from bouncing around too much and what have you. But even with these, where they're really thin and thin like this, I do have issue with these kinds of wet palettes, mainly because when you have these in the palette, because it's a little container, right? And then this will sit there, and then you'll have your wax paper or baking sheet on top of the palette. And as you add your water in, the water, because of the porous nature of the sponge, the water will sit along the bottom, unless of course you oversaturate the sponge. And then in which case you just have too much water in there, and it's just going to be a mess. Which, using, you know, my preferred method of paper towels, which is, you know, cheap, and you don't have to, you know, like once you use this and water, and you know what I mean, like it'll start to stink, just like a household kitchen sponge. It'll start to stink after a while because bacteria and such will collect in there and create a mess, and it's just bleh, you know. Versus paper towel, disposable enough that you can just get rid of it and, you know, not worry about it. And the way I prefer to do it is just having a few sheets. In the video I show, you know, just simply using 3 sheets of paper towel, lay it down, get it wet, not soaked, just make the paper towel wet, and then lay your parchment paper on, and then you go from there. And I prefer that method because basically what the parchment paper is doing is allowing moisture to wick through the paper, right? Allowing the moisture to penetrate through and keep your paint, as it's sitting there on the surface of the paper, keeps it moist, keeps it very pliable, and allows you to get more life out of the paint. Versus a sponge, where the paper will sit on the sponge, and because of the very porous nature of it, you have these little pockets everywhere, and the moisture is not going to go, and it's not my preferred method. Whereas a paper towel, it's almost like surface to surface contact. As we can see here, I just relayed my wet palette down because I'm getting ready to do some more painting on some models and such. And so, as you can see here, wet palette, a lot of surface contact. You can kind of see like where the little light spots are. That's like little air pockets. And so one thing to bear in mind when you are creating your wet palette like this is that your hands are clean when you're moving your paper around, just so that you're not spreading dirt and what have you around your palette, because that will be very annoying and become very frustrating what have you. So yeah, so this is just going to be a quick little demonstration really on the efficiency of using a wet palette. Hopefully, if you're not convinced, because really this is for a lot of you new guys and even some of you intermediate guys who, you know, you're very comfortable with your painting, but I get these questions all the time about, you know, how do I stop my paint from drying out so fast? I lay down a couple drops and, you know, the paint's gone before I'm even done using it. And then especially when we start getting into mixing colors and blends and things like that, we want those colors to be around longer because we need to work with that color because we found that perfect shade and we want to lay that down and we want to have a long life on that paint and be able to use it to its maximum efficiency and not able to on a dry palette. Not to say that dry palettes are bad, it's just sometimes, you know, if you're using, say, any additives or anything like that, like retarders or anything like that, then a dry palette is fine. But a wet palette is really good for those instances, especially when we're base coating. I really like a wet palette when we're base coating because I'm just using color straight from the pot, putting it onto my palette, and I'm just getting a long work life out of it. And really that is one of the big benefits, other than color blends. Color blends, if I've mixed a color and I want to have it for use, you know. And of course, most wet palettes will have a lid to them, so you can seal them up nice and tight. And I've shown in previous videos that this will keep for like a week and it'll keep the paint wet. Keep it on a horizontal surface. If you allow it to sit along an edge or whatever, the paint can end up running. So that is a slight, you know, annoyance. But for those times that you just got to take a break from your painting, you know, you got to go take out the garbage, you got to go do the dishes, you got to take care of some chores, you're going to go see the movie, you know, whatever, right? When you got to take a break from the painting and you can come back, you know, hours later and come back right to your colors, get right back to work where you left off. Happy, 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 happy. And it'll make you a happy painter. Happy painter. Happier painter. Happy painting. So let's get to the demo. I'm going to show just basically, I don't know if I'll keep a counter going, but let's see how many brush strokes, and because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some P3 cold steel, and I'm going to be working on a Vanguard Warjack from War Machine. And I'm just basically laying the silver out on it right now. And as you can see, I still have to lay out a bunch of silver on his halberd and his legs and his inside joins. And, you know, and basically all I'm going to do is I'm going to lay 2 little dollops of paint down, and you're going to see how far 2 dollops of paint go. You can play along at home, lay 2 drops on your palette, on a dry palette, and see how far 2 drops of paint go, versus with a wet palette, and you're going to see how far 2 little drops of paint will go on a model. And if that doesn't convince any of you not to make yourself or go out and buy a wet palette, then you are quite silly and possibly dangerous. And so count along, see how many brush strokes and how many times I draw from the palette, and how many times and how far the paint will take me. Just 2 drops. So here we go. The other thing I should mention is that I'm not using any thinners or extra water other than the moisture on the palette to apply and thin the paint down. There's nothing extra in here other than the moisture on the palette, which can be quite a bit, but that's okay because we're thinning our paints down. And so, let's go. So as you can see, I got through the silver bits of my model and even got the chance to go over them a second time. And if you look at the palette, you can see there's still a drop left, which, you know, there's still tons of paint there. It's really, I mean, like I could probably go over another time and lay down some more silver, or I can start laying out more silver on the other Warjack that's ready to be painted, like re-highlight his areas. But otherwise you can see how efficient the usage of paint is. And so hopefully it kind of sheds some light for a lot of you guys out there that it is a really good option to have in your arsenal of painting equipment, wet palettes. Just about everybody should be using them. And so hopefully you found that video somewhat informative, useful, what have you. And feel free to like, subscribe, and check out the wet palette video that I made earlier this year. I also had another one, but don't worry about it. And there are other techniques for making wet palettes. There's some that where you're using just household items. I can't think of who specifically makes that one, but I know there's a few that are, you know, even cheaper than $4. And if you don't feel like making one, then there are a few options to buy wet palettes out there. But again, hopefully you found it somewhat useful, and I will see you in the next video.